Hi everybody, welcome back to CMN 201. This is for our class for Thursday, November 30th, where I wanted to talk a little bit about 28 Days Later, and I also wanted to put some closure onto the previous film, which we would have done a couple of weeks ago because, as you know, last week was Thanksgiving, so we didn't have a class meeting, and that would be the Blair Witch Project. I am still working on your journals. I unfortunately got sick. The good news is that it wasn't COVID. So I am hoping to catch up this weekend with everything and to remind you that we are coming close to the ending of the semester so that we have our final project, which is going to be due on December 14th. December 14th is the last day of class. So that's the last day in which you could hand in anything. And your final project, as you know, is only one component for what you will be doing on the 14th. The final exam is the last component. And what I will be doing is posting the final exam online on the 14th at 6 p.m., which is when our class would normally meet if we were a face-to-face class. And you will have 24 hours to complete that examination. So that exam would be due on the 15th at 6 p.m. And I ask that you just send that to me via PDF to my email, the way you've been sending your journals at ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And what I will do is just ask a series of essay questions or offer you a series of essay questions and have you choose within that to respond. And the whole point of the exam is for you to be able to synthesize some of the major points that we've been talking about over the course of the semester in terms of horror film and its place in media and popular culture. And certainly I don't expect anything as neatly written or polished as something like a final project. I'm assuming most of you would probably be doing a paper for your final project, but as you know, there are more creative options available to you. At this point, thank you to those of you who reached out to me about your final project and run ideas by me. You still have time to do so. And the final exam, if we were meeting in person, would take place over approximately 2 to 3 hours. So that's how much time I anticipate you should be using to respond to the final exam that I'm posting online, 2 to 3 hours, but you have 24 hours in which to do that particular examination. And it'll be a cumulative exam, but it is open book, open notes. So you can use outside resources. And the idea is not that this is a test of memorization, it's a test in understanding. And if you think about our semester as a whole, we've talked about how horror films are lenses through which we could view particular time periods and some of the fears and anxieties that would have been prevalent during that specific time period. We started with the 1920s with The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which is credited with the first horror film, and talked about how much that film was influenced by the aftermath of World War I and the horrors associated with World War I, including what exactly is sanity and insanity and what is reality and what is fantasy, which I think was very much illustrated in the filming techniques of that particular piece. Also, it's read as perhaps a commentary on German authoritarian governments. If we wanted to see a Dr. Caligari as a representation or symbol of a German authoritarian government who was controlling and manipulating the masses being basically the Caesars of the world who are sleepwalking through the idea of their manipulation. And there are lots of other ways, of course, that the film could be viewed. But we moved forward to the 1930s, and that's credited as offering us the first film, the first American horror film, and that would be Dracula. and lots of different ways we can read the Dracula story, but it would be hard not to read Dracula without thinking about the context of the Great Depression, and that Dracula, being of an aristocratic background, could very much represent the rich aristocrat who's also living off of the life force, if you will, of the masses, controlling and manipulating the masses in some respects. Also, it's a wonderful way to sort of think about some of the fear of immigration that would have existed in the 1930s. And note that some of these fears tend to be somewhat timeless and universal, that they aren't just applicable to a particular decade, because the fear of immigration is something that is quite contemporary in our own decade. But Dracula as foreigner, and this idea of corrupting the European culture, particularly through bloodlines, because Dracula is all about sucking and biting, I think is a very apt metaphor for the 1930s. And we moved to the 1940s with Cat People, and we talked about the fear of female, particularly in the aftermath of World War II, where female had been employed in the workforce and then ultimately lost that power and ability, or was beginning to lose that power ability as soldiers returned home. Certainly there was a fear of the political force of female, starting from the 1920s on, where female had the right to vote. The fear of female sexuality is perhaps a fear that has existed throughout the millennium. We certainly had talked about the idea of sexual promiscuity seemingly punished in films like Halloween, as contemporary as the 1970s and the 1980s. And the image of female as either whore or Madonna with nothing in between goes all the way back to our early days of civilization. But it strikes me that at Cat People very much also is fear of foreigner, since Irina isn't just a female, and of course the concern is what happens when female cannot be controlled. But secondarily, what happens when foreigner comes and cannot be controlled by the dominant culture. We moved to the 1950s, and we talked about how Invasion of the Body Snatchers seemed to work so nicely in terms of commentary about political fears and anxieties about political other, particularly communism, and that communism would basically take away the soul of an individual and their individuality, and that the suburbs, being so ironic because everyone in the suburbs is the same, and yet this idea that the suburbs was a haven or an escape, particularly with the white flight movement that was occurring from the cities into the suburbs, again, to escape other, that which was considered alien. So that's another way in which the film could be viewed, the fear of alien or that which is other. But particularly, it's usually viewed as a communist parable. Of course, talking about other issues such as portrayal of gender is particularly fascinating, where we see a rather risque dialogue, but we also see this rather common trope about female being sacrificed, while ultimately the male is not necessarily held to the same standard or to the same punishment. When we moved to the 1960s, and we talked about it being such a particularly tumultuous decade, and that was my justification for offering two films. The first being Psycho, which is considered the first American horror film. It's a wonderful piece in terms of examination of psychology, certainly probably the most contemporary of the films that we've seen. I've always read Psycho as also a commentary on what happens with the isolated nuclear family, and that as there is a loss of a sense of community, there is a greater possibility of mental distress. Certainly we see that within Psycho. There are lots of other ways, of course, to read Psycho as well. But I had suggested to you that a video about Psycho and the Uncanny might be a particularly fascinating view of watching Psycho, and we had talked about the uncanny and Freud's theory that that which is frightening is that which is similar yet different from what we expect. Something that is uncanny is almost like reality, but yet not quite. I think that works quite nicely for something like Blair Witch Project, which I'll be talking about shortly. After Psycho, of course, we've got Night of the Living Dead, and such an important film, not just in terms of the way that it could be read symbolically, the zombie masses in effect, but the sense that we've got a male black lead as hero, and how brutally he really is treated throughout the film, and especially at its ending when he's killed. And one could say that it's very much a commentary on the treatment of African Americans in society and the fears associated with African Americans. Though the sense of revolt and revolution and the inability to trust the authoritarian institutions in power, whether it be police or government or media, I think is very much embedded in that film and in many of the contemporary horror films that also came out after that. After we talked about Night of the Living Dead, we talked about the 1970s and The Exorcist. And The Exorcist being nothing short of a cultural phenomenon with the extreme audience reactions in terms of the way that the film helped to defy and challenge cultural taboos in regards to sex and religion. And I think it very much also is illustrative about how the fear now is within one's own child. It's something that was sort of alluded to in Night of the Living Dead, but now no one is to be trusted. And definitely that idea of a retribution against single motherhood, against putting career over family, about the idea that this family, the McNeil family, is deliberately targeted, not so much to punish the girl as to punish those that are surrounding the girl. That said, I've always thought that The Exorcist has been misread and misunderstood. Everyone focuses on the possession rather than the symbolic idea of being haunted by one's demons, which all of the major characters are, particularly, as the title suggests, the exorcists, who are the stars of the film. I think that makes it a little bit more interesting when we talk about a crisis of faith. And again, the 1970s dealing with the fallout of the 1960s, where it seemed that the world had literally gone to hell. 1980s is oftentimes viewed as a conservative era with a call to return to family values. That in part was a political pushback with the Reagan years, known as Reaganism. But a film that came out not in the 80s but in the late 1970s, Halloween, I think helped to anticipate that idea and also served as the blueprint for the slasher film, which was so pivotal in the 1980s. Whether or not you want to see it as a kind of conservative response, that Michael is a conservative force that basically is punishing these wayward teenagers, or whether or not you want to see it a little bit in a broader sense that evil can never be killed. It just reappears in different forms. And that this is something that we've been grappling with, at least from a horror film perspective, from the 1920s. Of course, what we found is that the true evil usually is within humanity, not necessarily the outside entity. And of course, when we think about Halloween and the portrayal of gender and just the very important idea of final girl and how this a virginal female will be the survivor, but she will be tortured prior to her ultimate survival is become very much a horror trope. And then when we move to the 1990s, which is where we were before Thanksgiving, I like to show Blair Witch Project because I think it very much anticipated some of what would be occurring in terms of our technological revolution, though the 90s were certainly the advent of that technological revolution in terms of the birth of the internet. But you could see the importance of recording and documentation. And one of the ways that I like to look at the film is its question about what is reality, which gets us all the way back to The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And while movie techniques, because what we're seeing is a faux documentary, so that movie helped to establish that idea of faux documentary. It tries to mimic reality, but of course it's not reality itself, which means that it's a kind of uncanny, something that is real and yet unreal, which I think it is said so well by the character Josh as he's talking to Heather about how technology records, but it also distorts. And he says, and this is a quote, "I see why you like this video camera so much. It's not quite reality. It's totally like a filtered reality, man. It's like you can pretend everything's not quite the way it is." And of course, what we see are the misunderstandings and the solitude that's only facilitated by the technology that they have. The filtered film reality is the only thing Heather has to hold on to. This technology can't protect them against the horrors of the natural world, a natural world that they are ill prepared for. And of course, this theme of sanity and insanity that we've seen in so many other horror films is also in this film, because we can never know for certain what the events are. The power of the Blair Witch Project is that it merely suggests, it doesn't show anything. It's very subtle and ambiguous. And perhaps that is the greatest fear, the fear of the unknown, the fear of what we don't see. In fact, the word occult means unknown. Just viewing the film in terms of the contrast of wilderness and civilization, I think is an interesting way of sort of thinking about our contemporary society, that we have become so pampered in our, quote, civilized existence that the wilderness has become basically alien or other. A question perhaps to consider is that does the victim, particularly in a film like Blair Witch Project, whether it be through their hubris or their arrogance or their naivete, empower the monster by actually seeking it out, since they very deliberately want to find this Blair Witch, even though they are cautioned against it? That goes to show again some of the arrogance of youth, and as they are cautioned by elders in the community to leave it alone, but they continue their investigations. And we also see another common horror motif where the past, whether it be myths or ancient fears, in this instance the legend of Blair Witch, colliding with the present. And of course the present being their documentation in present time. But the past colliding with the present, I think, is something that we see through horror films, is that the horrors of the past are continually relived over and over again until we address those particular horrors. It's something that we will definitely confront when we get to a film like Get Out. But I wanted to talk a little bit about film documentation. And this is not the only film to sort of talk about the issue of the importance of documentation, and does documentation lead to reality or just another form of fiction? Something that I think is quite a relevant question with social media. Not that the Blair Witch Project would have come out at the time of social media, but one film that I do recommend to you is Jordan Peele's film Nope, which is at this point his most recent film. We'll be watching Get Out, which was really his first horror film that made his name so seminal in the genre of horror film. But Nope also talks about that idea of documentation. Note that, well, I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but we are going to be given some film footage when we begin 28 Days Later. Again, this idea of sort of illustrating about the importance of documentation and how the media can help to influence the masses. The film, and Projected Fears talks about this 28 Days Later, seemed like it was going to reach a kind of cultural status, and many people, myself included, thought it would, that it didn't. It's viewed as an updated zombie tale, because if you haven't seen the film, and again, I don't want to give away too many spoilers, you'll see that they very much act like zombies. However, these are fast zombies as opposed to the Romero zombie, and these zombies are not the reanimated dead. They are infected with the virus. The film seems to take on new meaning after we've experienced COVID. It, in many ways, prefigured its time, and the director, Danny Boyle, is British, had talked about that he was inspired by things like mad cow disease and how quickly it could spread. And, of course, none of us had any inkling of what COVID would bring to us just a couple of decades later. The virus in 28 Days Later is aptly named the rage virus. It's a not so hidden metaphor for how rage can quickly spread. And again, if you want to think about how well that works with social media, since I was suggesting that Blair Witch Project was very much an illustration of an anticipated social media that we are experiencing now, I think you can see how both of these films connect with one another. We see a very apocalyptic film. This is basically the destruction of society, or at least the British society. Thus far, we've been mostly focusing on America, except for Cabin and Dr. Caligari, which of course was Germany. Considering the time that the film came out, 2002, so I can say that from a millennium perspective, there usually is a certain level of fear associated with the possibility of the ending of the world, and I think that's very much embedded in this particular film. As we see, once again, a critique of media, government, military, also consumerism. So when you're watching the film, know all these images of consumerism that are now meaningless in this devastated society. A theme that we've seen in many of the horror films is the importance of community and others. So pay attention for that as you are watching the film. And what we have is a group of survivors who basically create a kind of new family. And it's a blended family. So now they all are of different ethnicities and socioeconomic backgrounds. And that said, I think that what you will find with 28 Days Later is a very brutal film, but a very telling film in terms of not just the ability for a virus to spread, but also the ability for hatred to spread. And I think about our own political times in 2023, and I can't think of a more appropriate parable. So 28 Days Later is a fairly long film. It's an hour and 53 minutes. So I'm going to leave you with 28 Days Later to view. I was able to find a link, at least at this point online. As you know, it's becoming increasingly difficult for me to find links for these films, free links that is. Of course, you can stream them on your own. And there are also DVD hard copies that you could watch through the JCC library if you so wanted to. Certainly, if you find better links than the links that I've been able to provide, please let me know, because I would be happy to share that with the class. And as I said, I'm going to be catching up on journals as well as discussion forum responses now that I'm on the mend. And what's left is just your attendance question. And your attendance question is about 28 days later. And considering what we've experienced with COVID and some of the aftermath, I ask you, what do you think our contemporary society could learn from 28 days later? What do you think our contemporary society could learn from 28 days later? As always, you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are required to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn. As I said, I will be catching up and responding. Hopefully that'll help you also, not just with ideas for the final project if you're still searching, but also with possibilities for the final exam, which I'll talk a little bit more about next class, where we are viewing our final film of the semester. And that happens to be Get Out. So I hope you're doing well, and I am doing better, if not necessarily well. And we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.